On Christmas Eve 1945, 5 children went to bed in their family home in Fayetteville, West Virginia, and were never seen alive again, but their bodies were never found either. The Sodder family residence stood like a monument to the American dream on a quiet hillside overlooking the coal-rich valleys of Fayette County. George Sodder, an Italian immigrant who had built his trucking business from nothing, lived there with his wife Jenny and their 10 children. The 2-story frame house, painted white with green shutters, represented everything George had worked for since arriving in America decades earlier. On this particular December evening, fresh snow blanketed the roof, and icicles hung like crystalline daggers from the eaves. Inside, the warmth of family life filled every room. The older children had helped decorate a modest Christmas tree in the living room, while Jenny finished wrapping the last presents in the kitchen. The familiar sound of a large household echoed through the halls, footsteps creaking on wooden floors, muffled conversations, the distant laughter of children preparing for Christmas morning. George sat in his favorite chair by the radio, listening to holiday music while reviewing the day's trucking routes. Everything seemed perfectly normal, perfectly safe. As bedtime approached, the usual organized chaos of getting 10 children settled began. The 4 youngest, Marion 17, Jenny 8, Betty 5, were already in their rooms on the second floor, along with Maurice 14, Martha 12, and Louis 9. The house had only one staircase leading to the second floor, a narrow wooden structure that groaned under the weight of running children. George had always meant to install a second stairway for safety, but never found the time between work and family obligations. At approximately 1 a.m. on December 25th, Jenny Sodder awakened to an unusual sound. Not the familiar settling of their old house or the winter wind rattling windows, but something else. A distant crackling that made her heart quicken with inexplicable dread. She nudged George awake, and together they listened to what sounded like paper burning in a fireplace. But they had no fireplace. The smell hit them next, acrid, chemical, wrong. Not the clean scent of burning wood, but something artificial and dangerous. George leaped from bed and rushed toward the hallway. Orange light danced beneath their bedroom door, and when he yanked it open, a wall of heat and smoke struck him like a physical blow. The entire first floor was engulfed in flames that climbed the walls with unnatural speed and intensity. The children, Jenny screamed, rushing toward the staircase. But the wooden steps were already consumed by fire, collapsing in showers of sparks and burning debris. Thick, choking smoke filled the hallway, making it impossible to see or breathe. George tried to push through the flames, his clothes singed and his lungs burning, but the heat was too intense. The fire had spread too quickly, too completely. They managed to grab 4 of their children, Sylvia, 13, George Jr., 16, John, 23, and baby Sylvia, and escaped through a first-floor window. But upstairs, 5 children remained trapped. Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny, 8, and Betty, just 5 years old. George could hear them calling, their voices growing fainter as smoke filled the second floor. Desperate, George ran to where he kept a ladder against the side of the house. It was gone. The 24-foot extension ladder that had been there for years, the one he used for roof repairs and gutter cleaning, had vanished completely. He searched frantically in the snow, following his own panicked footprints, but found nothing. His trucks wouldn't start either. Both of them, reliable vehicles that had never failed him, refused to turn over despite the engines being in perfect condition just hours earlier. The fire consumed the house with shocking speed. Within 45 minutes, the entire structure had collapsed into a pile of glowing embers and ash. No screams came from the second floor after the first few minutes. No sounds at all, just a roar of flames and the sound of George Sodder sobbing as he watched his children disappear into the night. But when morning came and the ashes cooled, something impossible had happened. The bodies of the 5 children were nowhere to be found. The investigation into the Sodder family fire began with a conclusion that defied both physics and common sense. And the more questions the family asked, the stranger the official responses became. Chief of Police F.J. Morris arrived at the scene 6 hours after the fire started, despite the police station being only 2 miles away. The volunteer fire department took even longer, claiming their trucks had frozen despite the relatively mild December weather. When pressed about the delay, Fire Chief F.J. Morris, who also happened to be the town's funeral director, simply shrugged and said equipment failures happened during winter emergencies. The official investigation lasted exactly 1 day. Morris walked through the smoking ruins, kicked at some debris with his boot, and declared the case closed. House fire, he wrote in his report. 5 children perished. Bodies completely consumed by intense heat. No foul play suspected. When George Sodder asked how 5 human bodies could be entirely incinerated in a residential fire, Morris stared at it with cold eyes and said, "Fire burns hot. You wouldn't understand the science." But George did understand science, and he understood lies even better. He had worked construction before starting his trucking business and knew that residential fires rarely exceed 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, not nearly hot enough to completely consume human remains. Even crematoriums require 2,500 degrees and several hours to reduce bodies to ash. The Sodder house had burned for less than an hour. George hired a private investigator and a fire specialist from Charleston. Their findings painted a picture that made the official investigation look either criminally incompetent or deliberately misleading. The fire had burned unusually hot and fast, suggesting the use of accelerants. Scorch patterns on nearby trees indicated the flames had reached temperatures far beyond what household materials could generate. Most disturbing of all, they found a missing ladder, cut into pieces and hidden in a gully nearly a quarter mile from the house. The telephone wires hadn't been burned by the fire, as the phone company initially claimed. They had been cut deliberately, the clean slices still visible on the metal cables. Someone had disabled the family's ability to call for help before the fire started. The Sodder family trucks hadn't frozen or malfunctioned either. Their gas lines had been tampered with, the fuel drained and contaminated with sugar. Jenny Sodder began keeping a detailed record of every conversation, every evasive answer, every official lie. She interviewed neighbors who had been too frightened to speak to police. Mrs. Ida Crutchfield, who lived across the valley, admitted she had seen strange lights around the Sodder property hours before the fire started. Not the warm glow of house lights, but bright, moving beams like flashlights or car headlights where no cars should have been. The bus driver who regularly drove past the Sodder house provided the most chilling testimony. He claimed to have seen objects being thrown onto the roof shortly before flames appeared. Not debris or burning materials, but what he described as balls of fire that seemed to stick to the shingles and burn independently. He had originally planned to report this to police, but was advised by his supervisor to mind his own business about the Sodder situation. Even more disturbing were the threats George had received in the months leading up to the fire. Salvatore Tonelli, an Italian insurance salesman, had visited the Sodder home 3 times trying to sell fire coverage. Each time George refused, Tonelli became more aggressive and personal in his comments. During his final visit in November 1945, Tonelli had looked directly at the children playing in the yard and told George, "Your house will go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. You are going to pay for the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini." George was openly anti-fascist and had made no secret of his opposition to Mussolini's regime in Italy. In a small town where many Italian immigrants kept their political opinions private, George's outspoken criticism had earned him enemies. But Tonelli's threat seemed too specific, too personal to be mere political intimidation. The investigation revealed other connections that made the family's blood run cold. Tonelli was associated with several local businessmen who had been pressuring George to sell his trucking routes to a competitor. The same competitor had recently won several lucrative coal transportation contracts that George had previously held. Morris, the police chief and funeral director, had financial ties to this same business network. What do you think is really happening so far? Share your theories in the comments. As the Sodder family dug deeper into the circumstances surrounding the fire, they uncovered a web of connections that suggested their children hadn't died in the blaze. They had been taken, and powerful people were working to keep the truth buried. The first breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A traveling salesman named Ray Bosley, who had no connection to Fayetteville politics or business interests, approached George Sodder 6 months after the fire. Bosley had been driving through the area on Christmas Eve 1945, making late deliveries to stores preparing for post-holiday sales. Around 12:30 a.m., he had stopped at a truck stop 15 miles south of the Sodder property. I saw something that didn't sit right, Bosley told George, his hands shaking as he spoke. There was this big black car, looked like a Cadillac or Lincoln, pulled up behind the building where the truckers usually park. For men were loading kids into back seat, not gently, either. The kids looked scared, crying. One of the men kept telling them to shut up or they'd get worse treatment. Bosley described seeing 5 children who matched the ages and descriptions of the missing Sodder children. The oldest boy, who could have been Maurice, kept trying to comfort the younger ones while a man in an expensive overcoat supervised the operation. What haunted Bosley most was overhearing part of the conversation between the adults. The man in the overcoat said something about teaching the old Italian a lesson about running his mouth, Bosley recalled. Another man asked what they were going to do with the kids, and the first guy said, "They're going somewhere they'll learn to keep quiet about their father's politics, far away from here." This testimony aligned with other reports that had been dismissed or ignored by local authorities. A motel clerk in Charleston reported that on Christmas night 1945, a group of adults had checked in with several children who seemed distressed and weren't allowed to speak to hotel staff. The license plates on their vehicles were from out of state, Pennsylvania, and New York. The Sodder family hired a private detective from Pittsburgh named C.C. Tinsley, who had experience with organized crime cases. Tinsley's investigation revealed connections that painted a picture of systematic intimidation and possible human trafficking. The Italian community in central West Virginia was small and tight-knit, but it was also divided along political lines that reflected the broader conflicts of World War II. George Sodder's anti-fascist stance had made him enemies not just locally, but within a network of Italian-American businessmen who maintained loyalty to the old country's former regime. Tinsley discovered that several prominent families in the region had been involved in sending money and supplies to fascist organizations during the war, activities that continued even after Italy's surrender. "Your husband stepped on the wrong toes," Tinsley told Jenny during one of his progress reports. "There's a whole network of these people, and they don't just make threats. They follow through. Taking children and relocating them far from their families isn't unheard of in these circles. It's psychological warfare." The detective's investigation uncovered a paper trail of suspicious financial transactions. Large sums of money had changed hands between several Fayetteville businessmen and out-of-state contacts in the weeks leading up to the fire. Tonelli, the insurance salesman who had threatened George, had deposited an unusually large sum into his bank account 3 days after Christmas 1945. Even more disturbing were the connections Tinsley found to a network of private schools and boarding houses that specialized in housing children whose families had experienced political difficulties. These institutions, scattered across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York, operated with minimal oversight and were known to accept children with forged documentation or unclear legal status. "These places exist specifically for situations like yours," Tinsley explained. "Families get broken up for political reasons, and the children disappear into a system where they're given new names, new histories. By the time they're adults, they might not even remember their real families." The investigation revealed that Morris, the police chief, had received a promotion and a significant salary increase shortly after closing the Sodder case. The fire department had purchased new equipment with funding from an anonymous donor. Several key witnesses had received job offers that required them to relocate out of state immediately after giving their initial statements. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was a letter found in Tonelli's personal effects after his death in 1947. The letter, written in Italian, contained detailed instructions for relocating the Sodder problem and mentioned specific amount of money for transportation and placement services. The letter was signed by someone using the code name I.L. Padrino. "The Godfather. Thank you for staying with us. The most shocking part is still coming." In the years following the fire, reports of sightings began trickling in from across the country, and each one offered hope that the Sodder children were alive, while deepening the mystery of who had taken them and why. The first credible sighting came in the summer of 1947. A woman named Helen Blevins contacted the Sodder family after reading a newspaper article about their ongoing search. Blevins worked at a diner in Summersville, West Virginia, about 40 miles from Fayetteville. She described an incident that had occurred 6 months earlier that she couldn't get out of her mind. A man and woman came in with 4 children, Blevins told Jenny over the phone, her voice trembling with emotion. The kids looked like they were being watched every second. The little girl, she couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, kept staring at me like she wanted to say something. When I asked if they wanted anything special, the woman snapped at the children to keep their eyes down and not talk to strangers. What made Blevins' account particularly compelling was her description of one of the boys. He had this distinctive birthmark on his neck, shaped like a crescent moon. He kept touching it nervously, and when he thought the adults weren't looking, he mouthed the word help at me. Louis Sodder had been born with exactly such a birthmark. The sighting led to the first of many cross-country trips the Sodder family would make over the next 2 decades. George and Jenny drove to Somersville and interviewed everyone who might have seen the mysterious family. A gas station attendant remembered the group because the children had seemed unusually subdued for their age. Kids that young, they're usually running around making noise, he said. These ones just stood there like little soldiers while a man filled up his tank. More sightings followed, creating a trail that led through Kentucky, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and eventually to the Northeast. Each report was investigated personally by George or Jenny, who carried photographs of their children to every town, every diner, every school where a sighting had been reported. The pattern that emerged was both hopeful and heartbreaking. The children appeared to be alive, but they were being moved frequently and kept under strict supervision. In 1950, a school teacher in Buffalo, New York, contacted the family with information that made their hearts race. Martha Joyner taught 4th grade at a Catholic elementary school and had noticed something unusual about a new student who had enrolled mid-semester. The girl was clearly traumatized, Joyner explained. She never spoke about her family, and when other children asked where she came from, she would just say her parents were dead. But sometimes she would slip and mention a brother named Maurice, or talk about a house that burned down. The girl, who was enrolled under the name Mary Fontana, matched Martha Sodder's description perfectly. The same delicate features, the same distinctive eye color, even the same habit of twisting her hair when nervous. But when the Sodders arrived in Buffalo, they discovered that Mary Fontana had been withdrawn from school suddenly, with the family leaving no forwarding address. The people who claimed to be her guardians paid cash for everything, the school secretary told them. Tuition, supplies, even a uniform. They said they were moving to Canada for work, but something about the whole situation felt wrong. The little girl looked terrified when they came to pick her up. A private investigator hired by the family traced the Buffalo lead to a network of boarding houses and private schools that specialized in housing children from disrupted families. These institutions operated with minimal oversight, accepting students with cash payments and asking few questions about documentation. Several had connections to Italian-American charitable organizations that provided services to immigrant families experiencing difficulties. The most promising lead came in 1952 when a former employee at a boarding school in Oyster Bay, Long Island, contacted the family. Maria Castillo had worked as a cook at St. Agnes Home for 7 years before quitting over concerns about how certain children were being treated. She described 5 children who had arrived together in early 1946 and were kept separate from the other residents. They never got mail, never had visitors, never got to make phone calls home, Castillo explained. The staff was told they were orphans from a fire, but these kids didn't act like orphans. They acted like prisoners. They would whisper to each other in corners, and I heard them talking about going home, about their real parents. Castillo's description of the children matched the Sodder family perfectly. Ages, appearances, even personality traits that only a parent would know. She remembered one boy who was mechanically gifted and spent hours trying to fix broken toys and appliances, just like Maurice, a girl who had nightmares about fires and would wake up calling for her mother Jenny. But when the Sodders arrived at St. Agnes Home, they found it had been closed and sold. The records had been transferred to a Catholic diocese office, but church officials claimed they had no information about children matching the Sodder descriptions. The trail went cold again, but not before Castillo shared one final, haunting detail. Before I left St. Agnes, I overheard the administrator on the phone with someone, she said. He was talking about moving the Italian children again because there had been too many questions. He said they needed to go somewhere where no one would ever think to look for them. If you're still here, get ready. The final truth will change everything you thought you knew. Decades passed, and George and Jenny Sodder died without ever learning the fate of their 5 missing children. But the evidence they compiled painted a picture of conspiracy that reached far beyond a small West Virginia town. And new discoveries suggest the Sodder case was just one piece of a much larger and more sinister puzzle. In 1967, 22 years after the fire, a manila envelope arrived at the Sodder home with no return address. Inside was a photograph of a young man in his 20s with a note written in broken English. Louis Sodder, I love Brother Frankie. Illo boys, a 90132 or 35. The photograph showed someone who bore a striking resemblance to Louis Sodder, age appropriately from a 9-year-old boy who had disappeared in 1945. The cryptic message sent the family on one final, desperate search. Illo boys appeared to reference a location, possibly a school or institution. The numbers could have been a case file, student identification, or prisoner number. George, now in his 70s, spent his remaining savings hiring investigators to trace the photograph and decode the message. The investigation led to a series of discoveries that validated the family's worst fears, while raising even more disturbing questions. Government documents released through Freedom of Information Act requests revealed that federal agencies had been monitoring Italian-American communities throughout the 1940s, particularly those with anti-fascist political activities. George Sodder's name appeared on several watch lists maintained by both the FBI and immigration services. More shocking was the discovery that the Sodder case was not unique. At least 12 other Italian-American families across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia had reported similar incidents between 1943 and 1948. House fires with missing children whose bodies were never recovered, combined with threats related to political activities. In each case, local investigations have been brief and inconclusive, with officials claiming the children had died in the fires despite lack of physical evidence. A pattern emerged that suggested a coordinated effort to intimidate and punish Italian Americans who opposed fascist political organizations. Children weren't killed. They were taken and relocated as a form of psychological torture for their parents. The network involved corrupt local officials, private institutions willing to accept children with questionable documentation, and organized crime figures who provided transportation and security for the operations. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In 1975, a man named Anthony Ricci contacted the remaining Sodder family members with information that his dying father had confessed to him. The elder Ricci had been a driver for organized crime figures in the 1940s and claimed to have transported children from West Virginia to locations throughout the Northeast as part of what he called political discipline operations. My father said they never hurt the kids, Anthony Ricci told George Jr., who had taken over his father's search efforts. They were placed in boarding schools, orphanages, sometimes with families who were told the children were refugees or orphans. The point was to make the parents suffer, to show what happened when you spoke against certain people. Ricci's information led to the identification of several facilities that specialized in housing children with uncertain legal status. Many had since closed, their records destroyed or transferred to organizations that no longer existed. But former employees, now elderly, began coming forward with memories of children who matched the descriptions of the missing Sodder children. The most compelling testimony came from a retired nurse named Dorothy Kane, who had worked at a Catholic orphanage in Albany, New York, during the late 1940s. She clearly remembered 5 children who had arrived together and were kept separate from the other residents. They were never put up for adoption, never had visitors, and were eventually transferred to another facility when they began asking too many questions about their origins. Those children knew they didn't belong there, Kane recalled. They had loving parents, stable homes before whatever happened to them. They would comfort each other and talk about going home someday. It broke my heart, but we were told they were better off forgetting their past and starting new lives. Kane's records showed that the 5 children had been transferred to a facility in Pennsylvania in 1951, but that institution had been closed and demolished decades earlier. The paper trail ended there, leaving the ultimate fate of the Sodder children unknown. As George and Jenny aged, they maintained a billboard on Route 16 near their property with photographs of their missing children and a plea for information. The billboard became a landmark in Fayette County, a daily reminder that some questions never get answered and some families never get closure. George Sodder died in 1969, followed by Jenny in 1989. Both went to their graves believing their children had been taken alive and might still be somewhere in the world, possibly with families of their own, possibly still wondering about the parents who never stopped searching for them. But the evidence they compiled over 4 decades of investigation reveals something more disturbing than a simple kidnapping. The Sodder case appears to have been part of a systematic campaign of intimidation targeting Italian-American families who oppose fascist political organizations. Children were taken not to be harmed, but to be erased, given new identities, new histories, and new lives far from their original families. The network that carried out these operations included corrupt local officials, private institutions willing to accept children with questionable documentation, organized crime figures who provided security and transportation, and legitimate businesses that funded the operations through political contributions and protection payments. Recent investigations have uncovered similar patterns in other immigrant communities during the same period. Families who opposed communist organizations, spoke out against organized crime, or simply found themselves on the wrong side of local political disputes faced similar fates. Children disappeared. Official investigations found no evidence of foul play, and families were left with questions that no one in authority seemed interested in answering. The Sodder children, if they survived, would now be in their 80s. They might have lived full lives under assumed names, possibly never knowing their true identities or the parents who spent decades searching for them. They might have children and grandchildren who have no idea they are connected to one of America's most enduring unsolved mysteries. But documents recently declassified from government archives suggest the Sodder case was just the tip of a much larger iceberg. Between 1943 and 1953, federal agencies documented over 200 cases of missing children from immigrant families involved in political activities. Most were attributed to house fires, industrial accidents, or family abandonment. Very few bodies were ever recovered. The files describe a deliberate policy of disrupting families deemed politically unreliable through what officials euphemistically called relocation services. Children were preferred targets because their disappearance caused maximum psychological damage to parents while generating minimal public sympathy or media attention. The Sodder family's 4-decade search for their missing children has become a testament to parental love and determination in the face of institutional indifference and deliberate obstruction. But it has also revealed a dark chapter in American history, where political dissent was punished through the systematic destruction of families, and where local authorities were complicit in crimes that shattered communities and left scars that persist to this day. The questions that haunted George and Jenny Sodder, what happened to their children, who took them, and why were they chosen, may never be fully answered. But their legacy lies in the evidence they compiled, the corruption they exposed, and the reminder they left for future generations that sometimes the most important truths are the ones that powerful people work hardest to keep buried. Somewhere in America, there may still be elderly people who remember a house fire on Christmas Eve 1945, who remember being taken from their beds and driven to the night to a new life they never chose. They may have spent 80 years wondering about the parents who loved them enough to never stop looking, never stop asking questions, never stop demanding answers that never came. And in the mountains of West Virginia, the questions still echo through the hollow where the Sodder house once stood, waiting for someone brave enough to finally speak the truth about what really happened on that cold December night when 5 children disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind only mysteries that have outlived everyone who might have solved them. And don't miss our next video. Subscribe to the channel and enter the placelet, and follow other stories so intriguing and frightening like this. Click on the screen to watch it now.